Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout LOUD, a weekly biotech podcast from STAT. I'm Allison DeAngelis.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, February 15th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
The pharma lobby has marshaled all of its power to fight Medicare's ability to negotiate the prices of certain drugs. How's that coming along? Stat Washington correspondent Rachel Cohrs joins us to explain the drug industry's struggle to make headway and how it factors into the 2024 election.
We'll also discuss the latest news in life sciences, including a twist in the future of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, competition to Vertex's pain drug, and Gilead Sciences' latest acquisition.
All that after word from our sponsor.
Hey, Readout Loud listeners, Bob Herman here, Stat's Business of Healthcare reporter and the writer behind the newsletter Healthcare Inc. Healthcare Inc. is a weekly newsletter devoted to unpacking the business and secret inner workings of the U.S. healthcare industry. If you're someone who has ever received a medical bill, or craves in-depth policy explainers, or loves a playful meme now and again, I highly recommend you check this newsletter out. Learn more at the link in this episode's description. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Thanks.
So, Allison, tell us about your tea troubles this morning.
Oh my God, I know. I was just thinking I must sound very perky in the intro, which is not how I feel. So as listeners may know, I'm based here in the heart of biotech, Boston, which, is at the forefront of medicine, genetic editing, healthcare,
but not mass
healthcare
transit.
Finance, not transit, no. So, I'm going to disappear in the later part of this episode because I was stuck on the subway on the T. Send your thoughts and prayers for my future commutes into our office.
Just another day in Boston commuting, when
Just
3 of the 4 lines shut down. There you go. Yeah, so Damian and I handled the Rachel segment today. But Damian, let's start Chatty Cathy today talking about Alnylam Pharmaceuticals and some big changes that they have made to a very important clinical trial.
That's right. There is a massively influential study that Alnylam is running, one that will probably swing billions of dollars in their valuation and determine the company's future. And that is on a medicine for ATTR cardiomyopathy, a disease we've discussed at some length on this podcast. It's a degenerative cardiovascular disease that is increasingly prevalent and has become an object of fascination in the drug industry by virtue of its prevalence and by virtue of how many medicines there are in the pipeline to treat it. Now, the Alnylam study, this is a phase 3 confirmatory trial, one that would go for FDA approval if it were successful. The data were expected early this year, and there was a lot of anticipation into this, a lot of picking apart of its odds of success. What we learned this morning is that the data will not come early this year. They will come more toward the middle of the year, but perhaps more importantly, that's because Alnylam has changed its statistical analysis plan and changed the primary endpoint of the study. And, we can get into the weeds of this, and I'm happy to, but I think the headline there is, and Alnylam's stock price is down double digits this morning after this announcement. The headline is, whenever a company this late in the process is changing its statistical analysis plan and primary endpoint, it doesn't exactly give off confidence to those of us on the outside looking in, wondering how this study is going to play out.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that investors hate, we can, we probably don't need to get deep into the weeds about the changes that they're making, but it seems like, and they had a call this morning and we're recording this and probably we're not listening to what they're saying on their conference call, but, it sounds like they might have looked at blinded data from this study and have now kind of tried to make some changes, both like you said, Damian, in sort of the way the endpoints are designed, but also in the stats plan and looking and basically extending the study to sort of get to collect more events, another 3 months of data collection, and all that confidence in the study, I think, or in the outcome of the study, probably erodes because of this, and you're certainly seeing that in the drop in the stock price this morning.
Yeah, I mean, we are saying all this with the asterisk that we don't actually have the data yet, so it's kind of hard to say, if this is good or if this is bad, but it makes me nervous. I just keep on thinking, have we ever seen a biotech company do something like this, tweak their endpoints after the study has already been run and have it worked out for the best?
I think there probably are some instances where, again, companies remain blinded to these data, right? So they're not able to sort of look deep into the data and see the differences in the arms, like the drug arm or the control arm, and they may be looking at blind stuff. There probably are. I'm trying to remember the company, and it escapes me now. I remember there was one company that made a change to an endpoint like in like this, and it actually worked out okay. But I think to your point, Allison, you don't know, and particularly here where sort of the fine details of the study are going to be so important. And Damien, as you noted, there's competition in this disease. We should note that BridgeBio, which is another company we've talked about on the show, which is developing a drug for ATTR-CM, their stock is up this morning, on this news, right? Because what may be bad for Alnylam could be good for BridgeBio.
And it's interesting because ATTR-CM has been a moving target for science, frankly, but for the drug industry as it follows along with these discoveries. It was once thought to be a rare disease. It is now understood to be much more common. There is one FDA-approved medicine marketed by Pfizer, an oral treatment that has been on the market for a few years. And the thing is, BridgeBio ran into its own moving target issues, I would say, a couple years ago when the first phase, or rather the first part of its phase 3 study, widely expected to be a success, was in fact a failure. And one of the things we kind of learned picking apart from that is that the data they were using to compare it to, the old Pfizer data, was done when the standard of care for this disease, which is a moving target, was quite different. And it's possible that Alnylam is kind of just feeling a reverberation of that same moving targetism that is this disease. And then, as you mentioned, looking at the blinded data, not seeing as much of a disparity in cardiovascular events as perhaps one would hope in a placebo-controlled study, they made this change. Now, it's possible that when the data come, it will be positive, that the drug works both on its own and on top of the Pfizer medicine, which are two of the populations in the study. And this whole thing will be lost to history, and Alnylam's future will be that of great success. Also possible it doesn't go that way. But it is interesting to kind of watch this gold rush play out where so many companies are developing medicines for this disease, because as each of them iteratively mounts a phase 3 study, they are kind of studying a different population because of the changes that have happened so quickly.
So this week we saw the unveiling of a new startup company, biotech company, that is kind of going after one of the big boys, Vertex, and their pain drug that we've talked about on this podcast previously. Allison, tell us about this new company.
Of course. So this week we saw the launch of Latigo Biotherapeutics, a company that's based out in California, was incubated by a VC firm out there called Westlake Village Biopartners. And their lead drug, their plan is to develop a non-opioid painkiller, pain medicine that goes after the same target that Vertex's pain medicine goes after. It's the sodium channel called NaV 1.8. It's been a very interesting situation to digest because so far they really are in kind of direct head-to-head comparison with Vertex. They're going after this same channel that's used to kind of interfere with the signaling of pain in a person's body. And they, like Vertex, are kind of primarily going after acute pain first, which has been another larger conversation, but they are really setting themselves up for head-to-head competition in this space.
Hey, Allison, when you talk to them, what did they say about their approach or their compounds that they're working on versus what Vertex has? And I guess they have the advantage of being able to sort of look at all the Vertex data.
Yeah, they do have the advantage. And looking at the data, they said it's good news. It helps, kind of validate what they're working on. I mean, with the caveat that they actually need to do the clinical trials themselves, and they actually are in the process. They're already in phase 1, which is amazing to see. We're in this era of biotech startups right now where so many of the startups that I'm talking to are either in clinical trials or have a very specific plan for, filing it for an IND within, say, 12 months.
What a concept.
What a concept. Well, it's a noted shift in the market from the last couple of years.
A good shift, I would say. A good shift.
I think a good ship too. They're planning on launching a phase 2 trial later this year in acute pain. They're kind of thinking, their pitch is that, well, first off, if you look at like the history of something like a statin, statins 1.0 were kind of okay. It was really kind of like the second and third generation that succeeded, and there, the kind of the atmosphere around Latigo is that they'll be able to kind of watch Vertex and learn from Vertex's, successes and failures in pain. They're also hoping that their drug could even work faster than Vertex's drug.
It's interesting to see this because in many ways, Vertex's success, and we've noted on this podcast that success is debatable, but at the very least scientific success in developing a sodium ion channel blocker is itself the latest part of an iterative process. There were similar compounds from Amgen, Genentech, a company Biogen bought whose name I forgot. Anyway, none of those became actual drugs. There was a time when this seemed like kind of a graveyard for drug development, despite the consensus that the target itself made sense. And then Vertex, by virtue of basically winning a chemistry bake-off, got to the point with the candidate that they have. And so it follows logic that there would, in statin-like terms, be a competitor on the horizon. Although it's notable that Vertex, unlike many of the last generation of biotech and pharma companies, is not really like a rest on its laurels firm. They already have a backup molecule that they're pushing forward in clinical trials that would conceivably unseat the one that we've all been talking about for so long. This is what they did in cystic fibrosis, is just iterating on their own stuff and creating products that would ostensibly cannibalize the revenue of their earlier stage products, but really widen the moat between them and any potential competitors. And that's worked very well for them in CF. And it's clearly the playbook in pain. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out now that they have a clearly defined competitor emerging, going after the same path.
Exactly. And they already, as we've discussed on this podcast, Vertex's, the phase 3 data that came out last month was not exactly like a runaway hit with analysts and outsiders. There was a lot of room for interpretation, particularly with how Vertex's pain medication compared to opioids. And, the kind of the study's inability to show a clear advantage above opioids. And this debate that's been going on of, do you go after acute pain first or do you go after chronic pain first? They're kind of two different markets. And from looking at Latigo this week, I got the sense that they're two different markets. And there's also like a little bit of a biological, chemical conversation about how this NAV approach that both Latigo and Vertex are taking, if it's operating the same, honestly, in acute and chronic pain. So we will be watching with bated breath to see how, these two companies succeed or fail here.
So we on this podcast and in biotech in general spend a lot of time picking apart the decision-making of one Gilead Sciences, and sometimes it feels like they're painted as like a gang that can't shoot straight. But it's worth noting that they have a wildly successful business in virology. They have a lot of money, and thus they're able to do deals. So the future is very much still theirs to write. And so this week we saw Gilead do a deal. Adam, what did they buy, and what does it maybe portend for their strategy moving forward?
Yeah, Gilead bought a small drug maker called PhRMA Therapeutics. It was, again, modest-sized deal, $4.3 billion. PhRMA is developing a drug called seladelpar. It is for the treatment of primary biliary cholangitis. I am not going to say that again. I actually practiced that before the podcast this morning. We're going to call it PBC, and it's a liver disease. It mainly affects women. It causes decreased liver function, and maybe it's sort of the hallmark characteristics of the disease is really debilitating itch that people get. And as the disease progresses to a more advanced stage, you do sort of have an increased risk of liver-related death. So this drug is already under review at the FDA. So sort of the clinical risk is kind of off the table. And in fact, the drug actually looks like it works really well. There is a drug on the market for PBC already. It was developed by Intercept Pharmaceuticals. I think Intercept was then sold off, but this drug called Ocaliva. And what got people excited about the CymaBay drug is that it looks a lot more potent and a lot more effective, particularly on that itch that is kind of the really sort of the debilitating symptom that these people with PBC have. So, Gilead is a company that knows the liver disease area very well. Obviously, they developed were one of the first companies to develop a Hep C treatment. So this sort of fits into their wheelhouse. We talked in a previous episode here about their cancer business, and sort of, I talked about, how within cancer, they're really good at cell therapies, but not really good elsewhere. And they should sort of focus on cell therapies. Here, obviously, they did a deal in liver disease, which again is another area of strength for Gilead. So I think this one kind of makes sense.
Adam, I'm curious, CymaBay kind of fits the criteria of a company that would be acquired by a big pharma right now with a drug that's, already in front of the FDA. That's exactly what many pharma companies are looking for. They kind of need phase 2, phase 3 assets to fill this forthcoming patent cliff that they're facing. Why do you think that CymaBay was acquired by Gilead? You kind of mentioned Gilead already has an interest in liver diseases. Are there any other things to glean from this deal?
We'll see how much competition there was for the acquisition, right? We'll once the SEC filings are made public, maybe we'll get a sense of if there were multiple bidders for this. We don't really know that right yet. Look, Gilead, we talk a lot about big pharma M&A, but Gilead is a big company unto itself, and these are the kind of deals that kind of tuck-in deals for a company like Gilead that makes sense. They have, as Damien alluded to before, they've been criticized for doing deals that are either sort of don't pay off or have not done all that well. The acquisition of a cancer company called 47, which they did, seems like it's entirely blown up because now all the drugs that they acquired into that deal are no longer. So this one seems like one that will work out. Obviously, it always depends on how big of a drug this can be once it gets approved. But I think, from a standpoint of the risk, this drug does not get approved, I think that that is relatively low. The other related issue here is, this is a liver disease that I don't want to say it's lower on the radar screen, but because I think a lot of people did think that CymaBay was going to be acquired, is the kind of company that looks like it would be a good target for a larger company. But, we sort of have the whole MASH fatty liver disease area out there. Companies like Madrigal, which is about a month away from getting their drug approved for MASH, and that would be the first drug for MASH. And so, people, would Gilead have been a good company to acquire Madrigal? Maybe, and there could be other companies as well. So, I think there'll be some interesting things to look at in kind of liver disease in the next few months. Yeah,
that's a good point. Why has no one acquired Madrigal?
Because of the damn GLP-1s. Note I said GLP-1s because that's how you pronounce it.
I am hearing more and more GLP-1s.
Because they're right.
I might be converting.
The 2022 passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which included a provision that would allow Medicare to negotiate certain drug prices, was arguably the biggest failing for the pharmaceutical industry in Washington in about a generation. And it set off shockwaves around the industry. Biopharma executives bemoaned that it would strip companies of their property and that setting different negotiation grace periods for biologic medicines versus small molecule drugs would stifle innovation.
Nearly 2 years later, the feds and healthcare groups are still fighting about the IRA in the courts and in public opinion. Stat Washington correspondent Rachel Cohrs joins the podcast to update us on a new court decision this week and how the drug negotiation process is going. Rachel, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So starting with the legal angle, in the months after the passage of the IRA, multiple pharma companies and industry groups filed lawsuits contesting the constitutionality of the law for various reasons. What have their arguments in court been, and how are those lawsuits faring so far?
So, each lawsuit is a little bit different, but generally there are a couple of trends here. They argue that the law constitutes, a taking of their property, that the taxes for not participating in the process constitute excessive fines under the Constitution, that their due process rights are violated kind of by how the law is set up. And there are some companies that are making some procedural arguments as well, beyond just the big picture constitutional arguments. So the lawsuits are pretty similar across the board, similar enough, in fact, that a judge in New Jersey is proposing to hear 4 of these drug maker cases all in one massive oral argument that could potentially happen next month.
Now, Richard, you wrote a story this week about I guess the judge tossed out the Pharma lawsuit, right? But it seemed like he tossed it out for procedural reasons, or and it wasn't over maybe the substance of the lawsuit.
Yes, that's definitely correct. So this lawsuit in particular was a little bit of a stretch because it tried to fit into this larger strategy by the pharmaceutical industry to try to file lawsuits in as many different jurisdictions as possible, to try to get conflicting arguments or decisions from different judges at the district level, to try to get conflicting decisions on appeal, try to get the attention of the Supreme Court. That's the ultimate goal here. And so Pharma was trying to finagle their way into jurisdiction in Texas. So they had added the National Infusion Center Association to the lawsuit. But the judge ultimately decided in this case that their claims didn't qualify for judicial review. They hadn't followed the right process. So that plaintiff was kicked off the case. And once that plaintiff was kicked off the case, they decided it couldn't be heard in Texas anymore because Pharma is not headquartered in Texas. So it was dismissed without prejudice, though. This lawsuit could come up again, but it was an early loss, but not on any of the substance of the constitutional issues that we're talking about here.
So outside of the courtroom drama that this portends, back when the IRA was first passed, the aforementioned disparity between small molecule medicines and biologics, small molecules would get 9 years before being subject to potential negotiation, whereas biologics get 13 years. That was something that people in the industry and in some cases in Washington kind of homed in on as a facet of the law that perhaps Pharma and the industry at large could find a way to motivate a legislative change to normalize those, to make it 13 years for both types of medicines. How is that coming along?
Lo and behold, the industry just last week found a Democrat to sign on to legislation that would change this disparity, as you're talking about, and equalize the amount of time before negotiation for both biologics and small molecule drugs. And almost immediately, the patient advocacy kind of group that's funded in part by Arnold Ventures, Patients for Affordable Drugs Now, started running television ads in its district, actually featuring my reporting on
not only your reporting, but we get a little cartoon version of your face.
Yes, my cartoon face is in televisions across North Carolina.
Congratulations! Is that like a bucket list for a political reporter in DC to be part of one of these ads?
It's never a goal, but when it happens, it's just kind of funny. At least somebody's reading it. So, it's a competitive district in North Carolina. It is a big biotech district, obviously, and it is unique because he was not in Congress when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, so he didn't actually vote for it at the time. So I think Pharma kind of found their perfect candidate here to carry water. But I think this ad buy was clearly a warning to other Democrats who might be thinking about signing on that it could be a liability for them in election year. I don't think anybody really expects this to pass this year, but I think there is hope in 2025, especially if control of Congress or the White House changes, that something like this tweak could gain some momentum.
So this has all been kind of a referendum on Pharma, PhRMA, the formerly perhaps quite feared and venerated lobbying group that represents the pharmaceutical industry in Washington. You had a story, Rachel, about a year ago looking at the passage of the IRA as a referendum on Pharma's seemingly waning power. And it seems like the group has had a difficult time of things since the IRA was passed. Arguably, it's lost its edge. I don't know, where does it stand now, and how does the fight in the aftermath of the passage of the IRA, what does it tell us about Pharma's standing in Washington?
I think, pharma has continued to struggle, especially in regards to the Inflation Reduction Act in Congress. But that's not entirely surprising because it's kind of the same group of people, especially on the Senate side, as passed this law. It's the same president that signed it. And there's just no incentive for them to make any changes ahead of an election. So I think Pharma as a whole really has viewed this Congress as kind of a lost cause in terms of making any substantive changes to the law. But I think they very much are banking on 2025 as a more favorable environment for them. The Senate, is a tough map for Democrats, and there's a very real possibility that it changes hands. And, if there's a new majority leader, there's a new agenda. I think they're just kind of holding out hope for some sort of Republican leadership that might be more sympathetic to their concerns.
So we've also recently seen pharma CEOs invited up to the Hill to give testimony. Most recently, I guess, Senator Bernie Sanders had a hearing about drug pricing. Rachel, you wrote about this. Is this just sort of more political theater, or is there substance here?
I think it is more political theater. And I think Senator Bernie Sanders kind of admitted as much that, he doesn't have the votes to do a whole lot legislatively. The ranking member kind of decried that this wasn't a legislative hearing. But part of the advantage of being the chair of a Senate committee is you have the bully pulpit. And he got a whole lot of drama out of threatening subpoenas of these CEOs, of, getting the photo op of them, in the room. I don't think we learned a whole lot that was new about why these medicines are priced the way they are, or, why the system in the U.S. works differently than it does abroad. But I think it was just an opportunity that Senator Sanders saw because he's always kind of worked on the fringe of the Democratic Party, of, establishment politics as a whole. And, generating that publicity and that public pressure is a tactic, even if there's no immediate legislative goals.
So speaking of political theater, and we addressed the contested North Carolina race in which you are on the airwaves, but I wonder, the IRA is, I think, really the signature legislative victory of the Biden administration, and kind of by extension his party in both houses of Congress, who are struggling to hold on to what they have and perhaps regain some ground. So with that in mind, and knowing that, lowering the cost of medicines is politically popular, pharmaceutical companies politically unpopular, that's generally been true, but seems especially true in recent years. How much do you think this broader issue might factor into races across the country this year, including the race for the White House?
I think the Biden administration is fighting an uphill battle just to make sure people know this program exists, because especially the Medicare negotiation program has not gone into effect yet. People aren't feeling those new prices, and they won't until 2026, which is a pretty long runway. There are certain provisions that have gone into place, like copay caps for insulin for Medicare patients. And there are some cost protections for Medicare patients taking really expensive drugs that did start to go into effect this year. But it is an uphill fight just for the administration to try to communicate what they've done legislatively and help people understand what they've done. And they have, tried to, have press releases about every incremental development in the Medicare negotiation process, really just trying to gin up momentum and coverage that this is happening. And my colleague John Wilkerson actually had a really interesting story about how these lawsuits by pharmaceutical companies could actually produce more publicity for the Biden administration, and just telling people that these policy changes have happened at all. So I think it's not going to be the number one issue on voters' minds, but I think the Biden administration really is trying to message that drug pricing was a part of this vaguely named Inflation Reduction Act, and that in the future it could really have a pocketbook impact for especially Medicare patients.
Rachel, it's always great chatting with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for another episode of the Readout Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and whether or not Allison should just give up taking the T to work. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
We'll see you next week. Hopefully I make it into the office in better time.